We have a couple of polls right just before we get into Marty's presentation, so maybe we can get started on those, Erin Ann. So welcome back, everyone. So the first poll here is a personal question. What organization or group are you part of? That's going to pop up just so we get a better idea of who is here today. This will give everyone in the chat or in the workshop a chance to see this, not just the organizers. So we thought this would be nice for everyone. Right now, we've got a lot of ENGOs and land trusts represented. The folks who are answering other, it might be interesting to know where you're coming from. If you wanted to pop that in the chat, what is other in this context? We've got about 30 more seconds to get your votes in. About 60% of you have voted. Ooh, Islands Trust, not land trust or local government. That's a good distinction, Deb. Contractors with local not-for-profits. Ooh, financial institution. These are the other categories. We've got 75% of votes in. Indigenous organization is another other by David Oxley here. David Haley, other forester, private forest landowner, and also representative of the Coastal Douglas Fir Conservation Partnership. That's a great one. CEO of Indigenous-owned forest management company in Saskatchewan. Welcome, Erin. And a community member, grassroots with Indigenous background. That's Shirley Samples. Awesome, so we've got about 80% here. So I think I'm just gonna stop it there to give us time for our next poll. So sharing the results, we have about 6% from First Nation Council, 2% from First Nation communities, 8% from the province, 2% from the federal level, 8% from municipal or regional governments, and 34% from ENGOs or land trusts. And our greatest representation is other, 45%. And so for our next poll, this is actually a skill testing question. We thought it'd be a good way to transition into Marty's talk. So maybe I'm not going to speak to the results of this about whether you're correct or incorrect, but what part of the CDF forest absorbs the most carbon? The canopy or leaves, roots, soil, fungi and other microorganisms, bark or cambium layer? So I'm not going to speak to the correctness or incorrectness of your answers. Maybe I'll leave that to Marty. So I'll give you have about 20 seconds to get your answers in. Looks like fungi are the top contender, but soil is a close second. Got quite a few votes for canopy and leaves here. Ooh, the soil and fungi are really neck and neck here. Oh, although canopy and leaves has really taken off. I love being the commentator on this. I feel like I'm a sports commentator, which is very much outside of my realm of expertise. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. It looks like neck and neck for soil and fungi. So we'll give Marty a chance to speak to that. So just to give Marty a better introduction, he is the West Coast Regional Soil Scientist with the BC Ministry of Forests. His areas of interest are soil ecology, biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, and forest nutrition and productivity. He's a member of the Provincial Soil Science Group undertaking North American-wide studies in compaction and site organic matter removal. Most recently, he's been examining nitrogen and phosphorus deficiencies inherent to coastal forests and their interactions on conifer nutrition and forest productivity. And his presentation today is called The Hidden Carbon and Diversity of Old Growth Coastal Douglas Fir Forests, Lessons from Fungi. So Marty, take it away.
All right, I'll try the share screen now. Mine's a PowerPoint, is that, everybody can see that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's interesting you had that poll to start because my answer, I think, would be none of the above. Let me explain. So if you ask people, you know, how would you describe forest in one word? Virtually everybody would say trees, right? But I think you're wrong. The word you should be thinking about is symbiosis, because these ecosystems are fundamentally symbiotes. Here's some pictures of the feeder roots on all our conifer trees. These are the fine feeder roots of trees that are covered in this mantle of fungi. And so this symbiosis works two ways. The tree supplies carbon, sugars basically, from photosynthesis to the fungi. And the fungi in turn do all the interactions with the soil. They bring in all the nutrients and all the water. They defend from pests. And so it's pretty clear from all our studies of natural forest, you cannot have a tree out there without mycorrhizal fungi. That just don't exist. And in turn, you cannot have any of these fungi in the soil without a tree. The two are inseparable. And so instead of calling these, trees, some people have thought that we should call them holobionts, which is kind of an awkward word, and I don't love it. But the point is to just stop thinking about a tree as an individual thing. It's not an individual thing. It's a community. It's a collective, a symbiotic collective, just like a coral reef. Every one of our trees is like this. And so, yes, these fungi produce carbon, and the carbon's directly in the soil, and they do nice things for ecosystems. But to sort of say, well, what's more important, the tree or the fungi, is sort of ridiculous. They don't exist apart from each other. And so they are all one. It's just all one source of carbon in my mind. Now, I think Bryony invited me to give this talk because she thought it would be interesting to talk about some of these old forest attributes that are beyond simply carbon, try and expand our horizons a little bit. Since I spent a lot of time thinking about fungi, I had a few thoughts to share. So a few lessons from fungi. Number one, diversity. There was a quote I remember, somebody was working the Amazon for years, and that, what did you learn from the Amazon? And the person said, well, God seems to have an inordinate fondness for beetles. And I would offer that she also loves mushrooms because they're incredible when you go out there in the fall. And not just so many species, but also every possible combination of shape and color and smell and stain reaction. It's just inexhaustible diversity. It's a lot of fun to study. And as you can see, I'm kind of getting into the photography side of this. And so we've been doing some work in the CRD watersheds, which is a very dry maritime coastal forest, very much like the CDF, just slightly less dry. And in our old growth stands out there, we found about 370 species across about 50 hectares of old growth. So huge number of species, very impressive diversity. And the other thing that we're realizing is that we haven't even named all these species. This beautiful specimen, I collected this outside of Jordan River, wasn't in the CDF, but anyways, just a stunning mushroom. And I've been working with a fellow from the University of Washington who does a lot of work on this group, and it was an unknown, and it's been collected a few times, but it's unnamed. And so when you're talking about fungi, you're still talking about stuff that we're still discovering even today. The second lesson I've learned over the last few years is that these are irreplaceable. So in a lot of the microbial world, we're moving to this sort of barcoding technology you've probably heard about, where you can get the DNA out of an organism and compare it across the world. This picture of North America here, so this species that I collected, when I put it into this website database, I realized the only vouchers of these things, the only place it's been seen so far in this world is in Western North America. And so these things are endemic. And they're not found anywhere else in the world. So about half our species in West Coast, about half the species in that old growth study were endemic. And so if we lose these species, they're kind of lost forever. We're not going to get them back from somewhere else. Lesson 3 is vulnerability. As land managers, foresters, the thing we most fundamentally change or manage is stand age. And I've done chronosequence studies, and a few other people have across the world. This is a study I did up in the Kispioks, where we looked at different, regenerating stands from, say, 20 years right on up to old growth, which is about 220 years there. And it's pretty clear that the richness and diversity of these fungi increase with stand age, probably at least to the 125 age, and then it kind of plateaus. And so this brings up a pretty fundamental issue that we have in land management. What I would call the ecological rotation, how long it takes for a community to recover from a disturbance, is longer than the economic rotation. So in this example, the trees die and the mushrooms come back. It takes at least 100 years, I would say. Whereas the economic rotation is more like 50, 75 years. And so we're sort of nickel and diming these communities when we shorten that rotation, but be below its ecological threshold. And I call this my hockey stick of doom. And this is just a sort of theoretical thing to think about. But the worst case scenario for me is that you do these kind of progressive clear cuts, replant them as monocultures, and keep it on this, short 50-year rotation age. Inevitably, if you do that over time, you're going to start losing species. And the point, I sort of drew this x-axis as 300 years, and I don't know what the time actually is. I wanted to make the point that it's probably going to be a long time. So there's a certain amount of resilience in these communities for sure. But the main point is that your trajectory. If your trajectory is down, then you have a problem. And it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And we're going to take these incredibly complex, beautiful communities, and we're going to be left with just the most widespread kind of weedy species. And then the lesson 4 is about effective mitigations. So we've been doing a lot of research on retention forestry, and this has proven to be really effective. You don't need much of a patch in an old growth or in a landscape like this. All these patches are pretty good at holding those species in place. They call them the lifeboats, right? And so we can sort of use this variable retention type forestry. We can really help keep these things on the landscape, and then they can more readily recolonize the regenerating stands around them. So we're still working on retention forestry principles and how big the patches have to be, and lots of questions. But from what we've seen so far, it's going to be very effective. And it doesn't take much. A small amount of retention can go a long way. And there are certainly many other very effective ways of going about this in terms of mitigation. We could talk about parks, of course. Parks are always a great thing to have. Old growth reserves is something we use in our land management. And extended rotations. People brought this up a few times this morning, and it's something I always emphasize. It's not in the 10 commandments that we have to cut down trees every time they reach culmination age. There's no reason why we can't just let trees get a little older. And I often talk about staggered rotations. So maybe if you want to try and balance the economic impact, you can talk about, we'll do a 60-year rotation, 60-year rotation, then a 120-year rotation, and have that scattered around the landscape. So there's always a healthier proportion of the landscape that's older than 100, let's say. So I think we can get creative. And I know there's an economic cost to all this, but the ecological gains are so much better. And lastly, just to sum up, I think people might be saying, okay, so what are we managing for mushrooms now? Isn't that a little hokey? But it's hard to study everything, right? There are a lot of this hidden diversity, a lot of these guilds, and I think from what we've seen, the scaling and the concepts are very similar. And so what I'm proposing, and some of these patterns I'm showing from fungi, apply equally well to insects and beetles and these epiphytic lichens and saprotrophic fungi. And so by managing our old forests for this sort of hidden diversity, we can hit off on all these guilds and have something in perpetuity throughout time, and not lose these incredibly diverse and important communities. So I only had 10 minutes. I don't know if that was 10 minutes or not, but I'm willing to take any questions.
Yeah, that's great. So we do have time for questions. If folks want to ask them, we can get them in the chat.
So just go stop share maybe.
Yeah. There we go. That's perfect. So we've got a few comments. Shelby Leslie says, managing for hidden diversity harkens back to Satnam's comment, putting a value onto the resource. Marty, can you speak to where the province is with regards to what you're saying?
Okay. Well, I think the province is slowly coming around to the idea that old forests have a huge amount of value beyond just timber. I think no government ever says no to jobs and money, and so that's the fundamental problem, is that we want to do the right thing, but there's always this pressure to not quite do the right thing, and we have just millions of examples from cod fisheries to everything else where we just try to do the right thing up to the point that it costs us money, then we give up. But I think we're making progress.
And thank you. So Andy Ellingson asks, how do we modify the extinction graph? What strategy will work?
Well, I think fundamentally is you have to have a healthy component of your landscape in older stands. And I don't know the magic number, but in the case of fungi, I don't think it'd be a huge amount, like say 20% would be nice. 20% that's at least older than 100 years. And it's because they're spatially, you can't just have one sort of park way off in the corner and then everything else is young. You really need to try and capture some of that spatial heterogeneity. So lots of reserves, lots of extended rotations, and just try and keep a certain amount of mature stands.
Mm-hmm. And Tori Archer asks, are there certain fungi that store carbon more than others, or is it based on biomass?
I don't know if there's this particular species effect. I know that, I mean, there's types of mycorrhizae. So some people make a big deal about arbuscular mycorrhizae, which is on like big leaf maple. So that some people argue that an ectomycorrhizal conifer stores more soil carbon than a big leaf maple, let's say. And that's sort of from correlations. But when they plant them side by side, they actually have difficulty finding any difference in the soil carbon. So I just think forest, you know, as long as it's a forest and these holobiontic trees are there, you're going to get where you're going to get.
Right. And Larry Pinn asks, what are the implications for long-term forest health if fungi diversity is diminished?
Well, that's a good question. Difficult to answer with any, you know, great certainty, but I'm kind of fascinated by this endemic species thing. Like, why are there all these species that are only on the West Coast? And biological theory would suggest they're here because they're specialists. They do something particularly unique in this environment, or they're particularly well adapted to these soils. So I have a current study going on more on the west side of the island in the VM1, like our true rainforest, the prohumid rainforest. And those are very nitrogen-rich soils with very low phosphorus. And the endemic species we're finding in those plots tend to have much more elevated nutrients than the non-endemics. I would love to do that study in the CDF or the CWH-XM, but I think, yeah, those endemic species are particularly worth holding on to in terms for stand productivity and sort of ecosystem productivity.
We should talk about that study. I would also like to see that study done in the CDF. We should figure out how to do that.
Absolutely.
We have a few more minutes, so we've got a lot of questions. People are very into this talk. Does higher elevation old growth in BC contribute significantly to fungi preservation?
Yes, but just like birds and plants and everything else, every Beck zone, every variant has its own community. So if you go up into the mountain hemlock zone, you're going to have a very diverse community, but completely different community of fungi than you're going to have in the CDF. So it's all about ecosystem representation, and then also within the CDF, it would be crucial to have the range of site types, from the dry arbutus type forest right down to the moist grand fir, sword fern type forest. They all have different fungi species, all worth keeping.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to take one more question. This one came in from Deb Morrison. How are fungi communities varied in replanted forests that were clear cut?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think biologically there's any reason to suspect that a natural disturbance is different from a man-made disturbance in terms of succession. So we know for sure that when you remove the tree, remove that carbon, you revert back to very early Cyril pioneer type system. And there are many, well, not many, but there are definitely some fungi that thrive in those early Cyril conditions. And then over time, things will start to come in from the edges, right? And so that's where having that spatial, like having old growth patches all over the place, allows that immigration into those stands. And that, fundamentally what I tell people is forests undergo natural disturbance all the time. All these communities are used to disturbances. And so a tree dying in and of itself is not unnatural. But what is unnatural is cutting it down every 50 years. Trees don't die every 50 years. And that's where the train leaves the tracks. Anyways, that's my soapbox.
Well, that's great answers. Thank you so much for this presentation.